The great hall of the Saffron Palace smelled of warm wax and ambition. Every chandelier had been lit, 1,000 crystal prisms catching the light and scattering it across the parquet in prismatic fans. And the combined warmth of the flames and the bodies beneath them had turned the air into something thick and sweet, like the inside of a jewel box. Aveline Evans stood at the edge of the ballroom with her leather-bound ledger pressed to her chest and let the heat wash over her. She was 36 years old, the most sought-after matchmaker in the region, and tonight was her masterpiece, the Midsummer Selection Ball. She had spent 4 months building the guest list, cross-referencing temperaments and bloodlines, mapping the invisible architecture of want and need that ran beneath every polite introduction in this city. She should have been focused, watching the young nobles swirling across the parquet, confirming which ones held each other's gaze a half-second too long. Instead, she was watching the far end of the hall, where a heavy velvet drape concealed something that had made the king's attaché visibly sweat for the last 20 minutes. Aveline adjusted her black-rimmed glasses and touched the mole below her lip, a small, habitual gesture she made when something refused to be filed away neatly. The royal family had commissioned a portrait of the king's cousin, Lord Valerius, to celebrate his engagement. They had chosen Silas to paint it. Everyone in Saffron Port knew Silas's name, even if most of them would have struggled to describe his face. He lived somewhere in the Outlands beyond the 3-foot building, a squat, iron-roofed landmark at the edge of town that marked the border between the city's order and its chaos. And he came into Saffron Port only when summoned. He was the most gifted painter in the kingdom. He was also, by every account, entirely ungovernable. The king stepped forward and pulled the cord. The music didn't just stop, it died. The painting that slid into view was not a tribute, it was an interrogation. Silas had captured Valerius with a brutal, unflinching hand, but it was the background that stole the room's breath. Behind the seated lord, Silas had rendered a sky so cold it seemed to radiate a chill, a pale winter storm blue that pressed against Valerius's shoulders like a physical weight. The color was so pervasive, so hauntingly familiar, that it seemed to bleed into Valerius's own features. The lord's dark eyes looked hollowed out by that oppressive blue, framed by the very color of the prince the kingdom had tried to forget. Every person in the room understood, without knowing quite how, that the artist hadn't just painted a man. He had painted a haunting. Blasphemy. Valerius's voice split the silence like a blade. The guards moved without hesitation, and there, for the first time, Aveline saw the artist clearly. Silas was tall, with black curls that fell across his forehead in the chaos of the arrest, and eyes that stopped her cold. A pale, startling blue, the color of a winter sky in the moment before a storm commits to itself. They had seized his paint-stained hands and pinned them behind his back, but he didn't struggle. He looked directly at the royal line, steady, unhurried, as if he had already decided what was going to happen and had made his peace with it. "You asked for a likeness," Silas said, his voice a low thistle thrum that carried to the back of the hall without effort. "I gave you the soul. If you don't like what you see, stop living it." They stripped him of his royal insignia where he stood and dragged him toward the massive oak doors. The crowd parted in twin arcs of silk and horror, creating an involuntary aisle. Aveline didn't step back. She stood her ground and watched him come toward her, and when he was close enough that she could see the oil paint still drying in the creases of his knuckles, cobalt, cadmium, white, she noticed that his blue eyes were not afraid. For a fraction of a second, his gaze found hers. Not the crowd, not the doors, not his executioners. Her. And in that look was something she had spent her entire career cataloguing in other people and had never once been able to name for herself. The doors slammed shut. The sound echoed like a gavel. Aveline looked down at her ledger. Her fingers were trembling against the leather cover. The names on the page, her carefully assembled, rigorously cross-referenced perfect matches, looked suddenly like paper dolls. Behind her, the ball was reconstituting itself, conversation rising back up like water filling a void. But she kept seeing those blue eyes, and the paint on his hands, and the painting, which was still hanging in the hall because no one had yet been brave enough to take it down. Aveline's home had the kind of quiet that carried texture. The walls held it, that specific after-midnight silence that settled into the filigree of her French provincial couch and pooled in the corners of the bookshelves. She had taken off her glasses to rub the bridge of her nose, and without them, the room softened at the edges, became something almost impressionistic, which was not a quality she usually welcomed. She was still wearing her ball gown. She hadn't been able to face changing yet. The knock that came was not polite. It was frantic, the kind of knocking that abandons rhythm because the person doing it has moved past courtesy into genuine desperation. Aveline put her glasses back on. Lady Isolde stood on the doorstep, hair undone, eyes swollen red, the most composed young woman in Aveline's entire client roster, reduced to something raw and urgent. "He's at the Rusty Spigot," Isolde choked out. "My suitor, Lord Cowan. He's been there since the ball, drinking, shouting about the painting, making a spectacle of us both. Aveline, please, if he's seen like that, the engagement is finished." "Wait here," Aveline said. She grabbed her coat, her glasses, her keys. She did not grab her ledger. She was beginning to suspect it wouldn't be useful. The road to the outskirts was dark and winding, passing the 3-foot building where the street lamps thinned and the shadows between them grew long enough to lean. The Rusty Spigot occupied a jagged corner near Causeyville Road with the particular confidence of a place that had never tried to be anything other than what it was. A neon sign, a sticky floor, and a policy of benign neglect toward its clientele's worst decisions. She was almost at the door when she saw him. Silas leaned against the damp brick wall just outside the tavern's amber glow, no longer wearing the palace's insignia or the studied defiance of the ballroom. His coat was torn at the shoulder, his boots were caked in glimmer silt from the roadside, and he was nursing a cut on his knuckle with the same careful attention he had probably once given to a brushstroke. His black curls had fallen loose across his forehead. He looked like a man who had been through something and decided for now to simply wait and see what came next. "Looking for someone, Matchmaker?" His voice carried the same low thistle thrum from the ballroom, but quieter now, stripped of its performance. Aveline stopped walking. Her heart was doing something inconvenient. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "The palace guard—" "Don't come this far down Causeyville," he said, stepping into the light. The copper-glinting amber of the neon sign caught the blue of his eyes and turned them molten. "And besides, I have a good view from here. Your Lord Cowan is inside. He's currently attempting to fight a chair." Aveline looked at the tavern door, then back at the man the throne had discarded. She felt something she couldn't immediately locate in her professional vocabulary. It wasn't pity, it was closer to recognition. "Help me get him out of there," she said. "And why would I help the woman who sells lies for a living?" Aveline stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her chin up to hold his gaze, close enough that her glasses caught the fire from the neon sign. "Because," she said, "I think you're the only person in this town who actually knows how to handle the truth." A long moment passed, then Silas pushed off from the wall. The neon sign of the Rusty Spigot flickered green then amber then green above them, while Cowan's slurred philosophizing leaked through the walls in muffled waves. Silas steadied his gaze at the matchmaker. "I have exactly 3 silver coins and the clothes on my back," Silas said. The bravado had drained out of his voice somewhere between the ballroom and the gutter. What was left was flat, matter-of-fact, a man accounting for his losses. "They didn't just exile me, they seized my studio. I need a roof, Aveline." "It would be a scandal," she said, her glasses sliding down her nose as she glanced toward the road. "A matchmaker of my standing, bringing a disgraced artist into her home." "Then don't give me the bed. Give me your expertise. I don't need a soulmate, matchmaker. I need a vault. Find me a patron, someone wealthy, someone bored, someone who doesn't mind the smell of a scandal if it means they get to own the man who humiliated the king's cousin. Match me with money, not love." Aveline felt the pull of genuine disgust. "That isn't what I do." "Compatibility is a luxury for people who have breakfast waiting," Silas said, and the thistle thrum in his voice went briefly sharp. "Right now, my only match is with the cold pavement. Use your ledger." She stood in the green amber light and looked at his scarred hands and the quiet, unsentimental desperation in his storm blue eyes. He wasn't performing helplessness. He was being honest about his arithmetic. the way the painting had been honest about Valerius. She touched the mole below her lip. "Fine," she said, "help me get him into the car. Do that, and I'll look through my records. But understand, the kind of woman who purchases a disgraced artist is rarely the kind of woman who lets him go easily. I've dealt with kings. I think I can handle a bored socialite." Inside, the rusty spigot was a haze of golden light and older decisions. Lord Cowan sat in the centre of a loose ring of onlookers, his expensive velvet jacket open and his hair in his eyes, addressing a chair with the passionate conviction of a man who had been wronged by furniture specifically. "Time to go home," Silas said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to steady the room's frantic edges. He stepped into the circle, placing a large, paint-stained hand on the wood. "You've bested the chair, my lord. It will never insult your honour again." Cowan didn't immediately register the voice. When he finally acknowledged Silas's presence, he whirled around as if the bar stool itself were launching a fresh attack. The sudden movement shattered his remaining focus. His argument vanished as softly as his equilibrium. Cowan didn't fight. With one final slurred condemnation of the palace, his knees simply buckled, depositing him on the tavern floor in a heap of expensive gin-soaked fabric. He was dead weight. Even for a man of Silas's considerable build, hauling a limp nobleman through a crowded bar was awkward, heavy work. A messy exit for a man who had once been the toast of the great hall. "Here, let me give you a hand." A man stepped out of a corner booth, wiping his palms on a stained apron. He looked entirely unremarkable. Barhand, probably, just another body filling space in a place that needed bodies. But when he caught Aveline's eye, he gave her a short, specific nod, and her instincts, honed by 15 years of reading rooms, fired all at once. The precision hiding beneath the deliberate slovenliness of his posture. The hands that were too careful. She knew what it meant, a groom from the royal stables, moonlighting somewhere he shouldn't be, for reasons he hadn't decided to share yet. "Careful with him," the groom said quietly, as he and Silas lifted Cowan between them. "The council has been looking for a reason to accelerate the Cowan inheritance for months. Word of this gets out, they'll move quickly." "Let them," Silas muttered, angling Cowan toward the exit. The groom leaned in as they reached the door, his voice dropping to a thin, urgent murmur. "It's not just Cowan you need to worry about, artist. That painting of yours, you didn't just insult the cousin. You painted the eyes of the king's late brother, the one who died on the hunt 3 decades ago with no heirs. The resemblance was—" He paused, checking over his shoulder. "Everyone who saw it is asking the same question. How does a rogue from the Outlands paint a dead prince's eyes from memory?" Aveline went still. She knew the royal genealogy the way she knew her own ledger, by heart, by rote, because it was the foundation her entire professional life was built on. The king's brother had died childless. The records were unambiguous. "What are you saying?" she asked. "I'm saying some secrets are baked into the blood," the groom said, already drifting back toward the tavern. "And Silas here might be carrying a ledger he doesn't know he owns." And then he was gone, back into the noise and the smoke, as unremarkable as he'd entered. They got Cowan into the back seat. He snored immediately, magnificently, in the way of men who have no idea what is happening around them. Silas stood by the car, the street lamp throwing copper-glinting light across the sharp angles of his face and the dark mass of his curls. He wasn't looking at Cowan. He was looking at the silhouette of the 3-foot building in the distance, and the blue of his eyes, caught in the lamplight, had gone somewhere else entirely. "He thinks I painted a memory I wasn't supposed to have," Silas whispered. Aveline leaned against the car. The night air of Saffron Port was cool and clean after the tavern, and it was helping her think. "If what he says is true, your situation isn't disgrace, it's theft. You aren't a rogue who needs a roof. You might be the very thing the council is trying to erase." She looked at her car, a dark silhouette against the glimmer silt of the street, and then at the unmapped road leading toward the hills. "Forget the patron," Aveline said, her voice reclaiming its leather-bound authority. "We're going to my house. We're going to sit down with every birth record and blood tie in my library and find out whose ghost they think you summoned onto that canvas." She paused, her black-rimmed glasses catching a stray copper glint from a nearby street lamp as she studied him. His blue eyes, those winter storm depths, searched her face with a sudden frantic intensity. "Unless," she whispered, the thought finally taking shape, "they think you painted your own eyes onto that portrait. Silas, is there a connection? Could you belong to that lineage?" Silas visibly stopped breathing. The world around them seemed to go still, the thistle thrum of the city fading into a ringing silence. He looked back toward the tavern, but his gaze was fixed on a past he had never been allowed to own. "I never met my father," he said, his voice dropping to a low, jagged rasp. He straightened, his shoulders squaring as the realization settled into his bones like frost. "In this city, I suppose anything is possible." Aveline steeled her back, the weight of her knowledge shifting from matchmaking to king-making. If she uncovered a blood debt this large, the country could change overnight. "Then let us go look for the truth," she said. Silas didn't argue. He didn't look like a man searching for a lifeline anymore. He looked like a man who had just realized he might be looking for a crown. "Drive," he said. The clock on the mantel ticked toward the small hours, and Aveline's living room had become an archive. Parchment covered every surface: the coffee table, the floor, the spare chair she never used. She sat on her sandy filigree couch with her glasses pushed to the end of her nose and a candle burning low on the side table, working through the branches of the great houses with the focused, slightly desperate energy of a woman who believes the answer must be somewhere in the data. Silas was on the floor, his long legs crossed, his curls still wind-tangled from Causeyville Road. He turned the pages of the family trees with the kind of care he had probably once used for unprimed canvas, slowly respecting the fragility of the thing. "It's not here," Aveline sighed finally. "I've been through the Cowan branch, the Valerius line, every minor house within 40 miles of the Outlands. There's no record of any child born to the king's brother. The ledger is clean." "Too clean," Silas said. He looked up from the floor, and the lamplight found his eyes, that pale, startling blue, the color of a winter sky in the moment before the storm commits to itself. And Aveline felt something shift in her chest. It was not the first time tonight. She filed the sensation carefully under matters to be addressed later. "They didn't just exile me," he said, his voice flat. "They erased the fact that I exist." He stood and moved to the couch. Not to claim space, he sat on the edge of it, the way a man sits on unfamiliar furniture when he isn't sure of his welcome. The air shifted with the scent of oil paints that hadn't quite left his skin, and her lavender soap. Aveline touched the mole below her lip. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers barely making contact. "Aveline!" Her foot connected with something solid beneath the coffee table. She froze, then she reached down and pulled out a heavy leather-bound box she had last touched years ago. A collection of miscellaneous files from a retiring archivist who had wanted someone careful to take custody of them. She had tucked it under the table and essentially forgotten it existed. "Wait," she breathed. Her hands were not quite steady as she opened it and paged past the servants and the commoners to a section at the very back, sealed with plain black wax. No crest, no name, just the wax and the deliberate blankness of something that had been made to look like nothing. She broke the seal. Inside was a single page. No name for the father, only a date that matched exactly the date of the king's brother's final hunt. The mother's name, Marina of the Outlands. Tucked into the fold of the parchment was a small hand-drawn sketch of an infant with a notation beside it. Sunstone mark, left shoulder. Aveline's finger trembled as she traced the hand-drawn sketch in the back of the untethered ledger. "The child," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the thistle thrum of the rain outside. "It says here, he had a birthmark, a sunstone, right on the blade of the left shoulder." Silas went deathly still. He didn't look at the book. Instead, his hand reached up, almost involuntarily, clutching the heavy wool of his coat over his left shoulder. "My mother told me it was a kiss from the storm," Silas said, his voice cracking. "She said it was the reason she had to keep me in the shadows, far from the city lights. I thought it was just a stain of the Outlands." He didn't have to show her. The look of shattered glass in his eyes was proof enough. The sunstone wasn't just a mark, it was a royal seal, written in skin. "If you have that mark," Aveline said, her black-rimmed glasses slipping down her nose, Then Thorn didn't just exile you. He's been waiting for you to die so the garden could be finished. If we go to the palace now, we aren't just presenting a painting. We're presenting the body of the crime." She almost missed the note in the margin. It was written in a different hand, older, more authoritative, and she recognized the penmanship from 36 years of studying royal documents. The king's own handwriting. The artist sees what the king must hide. If the seed takes root, the garden must be burned. The silence in the room was the loudest thing Aveline had ever heard. She looked at Silas. She looked at the page. She looked at Silas again. "You aren't just an heir," she said, her voice barely a breath. "You're the reason the king's brother didn't die of natural causes. You're the witness they forgot to kill." The warmth between them vanished, replaced by something cold and exact. Silas looked at the ledger, and his face rearranged itself into something she had not seen before. Not the defiant artist, not the sardonic rogue. Something older, something that looked, she thought, very much like regal fury. They sat with the black wax ledger between them for a long time. The candle burned down another inch. Silas had moved to the window without her noticing. He did that, she was learning, moved through space quietly for a large man, and stood looking out at Causeyville Road with his arms crossed and his curls falling across his face. "The man who killed the prince is still out there," Aveline said quietly, "and if he was at the ball tonight, if he saw your eyes in that room—" "He's not just watching," Silas said. His voice was a low thistle thrum now in a minor key. "He's cleaning up." The knock at the door arrived with the deliberate, weighted rhythm of someone who knocks to announce authority rather than to request admission. 3 blows evenly spaced. Aveline's thumb went to the mole below her lip. "The study," she said, keeping her voice low. "There's a floorboard hatch behind the reading chair. Go. Now." He didn't move immediately. He turned from the window and looked at her, checking her, she understood, looking for the fracture where fear might be tipping towards self-preservation. She held his gaze and didn't blink, and after a moment something in his expression unlocked. He went. Commander Thorne stepped inside without waiting to be invited, which told her everything she needed to know about how tonight was going to go. He smelled of rain and expensive tobacco and brought with him the particular cold of a man who had long since stopped being bothered by what he was asked to do. "Miss Evans," he said, his eyes already moving across the room, cataloguing, settling on the sea of papers on her table, a messy workspace for such a meticulous woman. "I'm looking for the artist." Aveline sat down on her sandy filigree couch and crossed her legs with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent 36 years managing the expectations of powerful men. She knew how to be the least interesting person in a room. "Lord Cowan was my concern tonight, Commander. My matches need to stay sober. The artist disappeared into the mud of Causeyville the moment we had Cowan in the car. I imagine he's halfway to the Outlands by now." Thorne walked to the table and picked up a sheet of parchment, a minor family tree, nothing dangerous, and crumpled it in his fist with the unhurried contempt of a man demonstrating what he could do. "He's dangerous, Aveline. He sees things that aren't there. I'd hate for a woman of your vibrancy to be caught in his delusions." He leaned down, his face near hers. She looked at him through her glasses with a professional serenity she did not entirely feel. "I match hearts, Commander. I don't harbor criminals. If I see him, you'll be the first to know." He lingered. His gaze dropped to the floorboards, just for a moment, just long enough to make her heartbeat stutter, before he finally nodded and left. The door clicked shut. His carriage rattled away toward the 3-foot building. The silence that returned was denser than the one before, more expensive. Silas came out of the study. He didn't say anything. He crossed the room and sat on the floor at her feet, leaning his back against the side of the couch, and after a moment he reached up and rested his hand against the hem of her sleeve. Not grasping, just making contact. "You lied to the most dangerous man in the kingdom for me," he said. Aveline looked down at the dark mass of his curls and kept her hand very still. "Get some sleep," she said softly. "We'll figure out the rest in the morning." Days passed. From the outside, Aveline's life looked exactly as it always had. Her car moved past the 3-foot building on its regular schedule. She kept her appointments, sent her correspondence, maintained the careful professional face that Saffron Port had come to rely on. From the inside, the house had changed in ways she couldn't quite account for and wasn't entirely trying to. Silas couldn't go to the market without risking Thorne's men, so he turned his attention to what was available. Aveline's study was full of the tools of her sensory profiling work: jars of dried hibiscus, bundles of lavender, rare threads of saffron, the ingredients she used to build the scent portraits that helped her understand what her clients were actually looking for beneath all the things they said they wanted. He had discovered them on the second day and had been slowly, methodically working his way through them ever since. On the fourth afternoon, she found him on the floor near the couch with his sleeves rolled up, the muscles of his forearms moving with quiet precision as he ground dried cornflowers in a stone pestle. The late light came through the curtains and caught the blue of his eyes, and for a moment she stood in the doorway and let herself simply look. "You use all of this to find a match?" he asked, not looking up. "Love isn't just a name on a ledger," Aveline said, settling onto the couch. "It's a chemical reaction, a certain scent, a certain quality of light. It activates something in a person's memory, a home they haven't found yet." He looked up at her, that blue gaze, steady and unhurried. "Then let me show you how I see your colors." He added gum arabic and water to the cornflower powder and worked the mixture into a thin, brilliant pigment. Without a canvas, he used the back of one of her old discarded match files, a form she had filled out wrong years ago and set aside. She watched him work in the copper-glinting late sun and didn't speak, because the room didn't need words in it right then. He handed her a small sheet of parchment when he was done. It wasn't a portrait. It was a wash of color, deep violets, warm ambers, a single sharp stroke of black cutting through the center like a line she hadn't known was there. "What is it?" she asked. "The way you smell when you're thinking too hard," he said, a ghost of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "Lavender and old paper and the storm that's always running just behind your eyes." Aveline felt heat in her face that had nothing to do with the fireplace. She looked at the watercolor, the colors bleeding messily into each other, beautiful and uncontrolled, the exact opposite of every system she had built her life on. "It isn't standardized," she said. "Nothing worth having ever is," he replied. For a while after that, neither of them spoke. He stayed on the floor near the couch, his hand resting against the filigree wood beside her foot, and she didn't ask him to move. Outside, the wind moved through Causeyville Road, and the afternoon went on, doing what afternoons do, and the monsters outside the door were, for now, held at bay by the smell of crushed flowers and the sound of each other breathing. The scent of crushed iris still hung in the room the next evening when Silas asked the question she had been quietly dreading. He was leaning against the hearth, the dying fire casting long shadows across the sharp angles of his face. He had been watching her for some time with the particular quality of attention he gave to things he was trying to understand. Not scrutiny, something more patient than that. More like study. "You spend your life weaving other people together," he said. The thistle thrum of his voice was low and unhurried. "You can see the shape of what's missing in someone from across a crowded room. So tell me, who is the match for Aveline Evans?" She adjusted her glasses. "My name is in the ledger as the witness. That's my place." "That's a lie," he said gently. She looked at the watercolor he had made the day before, which she had propped up on the mantel without quite admitting to herself that she'd done it. She could hear the wind coming off Causeyville Road. "There isn't one," she said finally. "I've spent 36 years looking at the world through a lens of compatibility. I can see the gears of it, how a merchant needs a wife with a steady hand, how a nobleman needs a bride with a cold heart to balance his fire. But when I look at myself, I see someone who doesn't fit the system I've been building. Too much of everything, too observant, too vibrant for the standardized boxes they want us all to live in." She looked at her hands, folded in her lap. "I became a matchmaker because I realized early on that I could see clearly for everyone else, but I never felt like anyone's match. I'm the librarian of a library I'll never be a character in." The honesty sat between them, raw and undecorated. Silas moved away from the hearth and came to sit on the edge of the couch. He didn't try to take her hand. He just came close enough that she could see the blue of his eyes clearly. That winter storm blue she had been cataloguing without permission since the night at the palace. "You think you're a disruption in the system," he said, "but maybe the reason you haven't found a match is because you're looking in the wrong ledger. You've been searching for someone who fits the order. But the order is a lie, Aveline. It doesn't account for the fire." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I was 7 when they took me from the Outlands. I remember the smell of my mother's bread and the way the sun hit the salt flats in the early morning. They called me a broken seed. I felt like a disruption too, a rogue element in a kingdom built from stone." He looked back at her, and the lamplight made the blue of his eyes burn and his dark curls shine. "We are the same, Aveline. We are the ones who see the truth that everyone else is too afraid to look at directly. You aren't the witness, you're the centerpiece. You just haven't had a ledger that could hold you." She didn't answer him, but she didn't move away either, and he stayed where he was, in the tension of her confession. Outside, the wind moved through Cosyville Road, and the 3-foot building stood at the edge of town at the border between order and everything the order couldn't hold. But the border, she thought, was not a wall. It was a door. The young Viscount's estate smelled of fresh lilies and underdeveloped judgment. Every surface was white marble. Every detail was new money performing old confidence. The couple, young, wealthy, giddy with each other in the particular way of people who have not yet been tested, had been chasing each other through the topiary gardens for 40 minutes when they were supposed to be choosing wedding flowers. Aveline stood in the drawing room in her professional coat and her black-rimmed glasses and kept her face neutral. Silas stood behind her, carrying her palette of scent samples and color swatches in a plain linen coat that couldn't quite disguise the breadth of his shoulders. He was doing an admirable job of looking like an assistant. His dark curls were tied back. His blue eyes were doing significantly less admirable work of concealing his opinions about the room. "They're playing house," he murmured near her ear. "They're young," she replied, touching the mole below her lip. "They're not listening to each other." He wasn't wrong. The fiancé was laughing, high and unguarded, snatching a silk sample from the Viscount's hand, and the Viscount was laughing too. But his grip on his champagne glass was too tight, and when the fiancé turned away, he watched the door for a moment with an expression that wasn't playfulness at all. Now the afternoon was turning unruly, and the consultation was going nowhere, and Aveline and Silas looked at each other with the silent decision-making of two people who had spent enough time in crisis together to have developed a shorthand. "Enough," Aveline said aloud, "to the room this time." The couple stopped. People stopped when she used that tone. It was one of the most useful things about her profession. "You are building a house," she said, stepping forward, "not a playground. You want to know if you're a match? Stop looking at the flowers. Look at the foundation." She glanced at Silas. "Show them." He took a stick of charcoal from her kit and turned over one of the expensive ivory wedding invitations. He sketched quickly, not the couple's faces, but the way they stood. The precise distance between their shoulders, the grip on the glass, the direction of the fiancée's eyes when she thought she was unobserved. He set the sketch on the table between them. "This is what you look like when the music stops," he said. "If you can't love the person in that sketch, don't buy the flowers." The Viscount's fiancée picked it up. Something happened in her face. The performance of giddiness dropped away, and something real came up underneath it. She looked at the Viscount. He looked at her. Neither of them laughed. Aveline uncapped the 2 vials she had prepared. One was sharp and citrusy, bright as a morning argument. The other was deep and grounded, wet earth after rain. "He's shown you the sight. Now smell the reality. One of you is the sky and one is the soil. If the soil doesn't hold the sky, the storm washes you both away. Tell each other which is which, and mean it." The couple began to talk. Really talk. Quietly, with the careful honesty of people who have just realized the stakes are higher than the centerpieces. Aveline and Silas walked back to her car in the late afternoon light, past the manicured hedges, out toward Cosyville Road. The shadow of the 3-foot building stretched long in the distance. "We make a terrifyingly good team," Aveline said. "We aren't a team, Aveline," Silas said, stepping into her space. His shadow fell over her. "We're a match, and I think you've known it since the moment the palace doors slammed shut." He didn't wait for her to consult a ledger. His hand found her jaw, calloused, careful, certain, his thumb resting just beside the mole below her lip. The kiss on Causeyville Road was not polite. It tasted of the salt on his skin and the wild, unscheduled fire of a woman stepping out of the library for the first time. For a long moment, the 3-foot building and the council and the whole elaborate machinery of the kingdom did not exist. There was only the thistle thrum of 2 people discovering that the ledger had been wrong all along. "Let's go," Silas whispered against her lips. "Before the stars decide we've had enough." They drove back toward the city as the sun went down, Aveline's glasses reflecting the passing street lamps like sparks. When they came through the door of her house, it had barely clicked shut before the evening became something private and urgent and entirely their own. The weeks of accumulated proximity finally finding their shape, and the expert was gone, and there was only the woman. And then the world broke in. The silence of the library was shattered not by a knock, but by the heavy, rhythmic thistle thrum of iron-shod boots on the gravel outside. "They're here," Silas whispered, the regal fury in his eyes sharpening into the focus of a hunted animal. He didn't reach for a weapon, he reached for the ledger, slamming it shut. "The back way," Aveline urged, her black-rimmed glasses reflecting the flicker of the dying fire. "My car is in the shed. If we can reach the North Road—" But the doors didn't give them the chance. They groaned under the weight of an iron-reeved ram, the wood splintering like bone. Into the warmth of the library stepped the King's Guard, their breastplates catching the copper glint of the hearth. At their center stood Thorn, looking not like a statesman, but like a gardener coming to pull a weed. "The king has a fondness for his gardens," Thorn said, his voice as dry as parchment. "But he loathes a trespasser. You've been looking at things that don't belong to you, Miss Aveline." "It belongs to the truth," she snapped, standing between Thorn and Silas. Thorn didn't even look at her. His gaze was fixed on Silas's left shoulder. "The truth is a fire, my lady, and it is about to consume this house. Take them. To the East Gallery. Let the king see what his brother's kiss from the storm has grown into." The journey to the palace was a blur of neon-bright street lamps and the rhythmic metallic clank of the carriage wheels, a sound that felt like a clock ticking down to an execution. Silas sat opposite Aveline, his hands bound in heavy hemp rope that looked coarse against his fine, paint-stained knuckles. He didn't look like a prisoner. He looked like a storm held in a cage. When the doors to the East Gallery finally groaned open, the air changed. It was thick with the scent of floor wax and old secrets. High above, the vaulted ceilings were lost in shadow, but the walls were lined with the massive gold-framed eyes of the dead. Thorn led them toward the center of the hall, where a single easel stood covered in heavy velvet. Nearby, Lord Valerius was pacing, his footsteps echoing like gunshots against the marble. He stopped when he saw Silas, his eyes darting to the left shoulder of the artist's coat, as if he could see the sunstone mark burning through the fabric. "You brought the contagion into my house, Thorn," Valerius said, his voice a jagged edge of anxiety. "You should have burned the garden 30 years ago when the frost first set in." "I am a gardener of precision, my lord," Thorn replied, stepping into a pool of copper-glint light. "I do not destroy what can still be used to weed out the rest of the dissenters." Thorn turned to Silas, a slow, predatory smile creeping across his face. The girl thought she found a king in a ledger, but a king is nothing without a crown, and a bastard is nothing but a ghost with a familiar face. He reached out, his hand hovering over the velvet shroud on the easel, the painting Silas had created in the great hall. "Let us see," Thorn whispered, "if the true image looks more like the man on the throne or the man in the dirt." With a violent tug, the velvet fell. The winter storm blue of the painting's background seemed to explode into the room, filling the gallery with that unforgiving frozen light. Aveline gasped. In the flickering torchlight, the portrait didn't just look like Valerius. Because of the way the light hit the layers of oil, the face seemed to shift. For a heartbeat, the man in the painting had the exact regal fury of the man standing in chains beside her. "It's not a likeness," Aveline whispered, her black-rimmed glasses sliding as she looked from the canvas to Silas. "It's a mirror." The silence that followed Silas's revelation was not empty. It was a physical pressure, thick with the scent of old dust, floor wax, and the sharp, metallic tang of dying torches. High above, the vaulted ribs of the ceiling seemed to pull the shadows inward, as if the palace itself were holding its breath. Valerius lunged. It was a desperate, ugly movement, the scramble of a man who realized his life was a house of cards collapsing in a gale. He reached for a decorative blade mounted upon the mahogany paneling, his fingers clawing at the hilt, but the air was suddenly sliced by the sound of drawing steel. It wasn't Silas who moved, it was the captain of the guard. The heavy, rhythmic thistle thrum of his boots echoed against the marble as he stepped between the pretender and the artist. With a single gauntleted hand, he shoved Valerius back. The lord hit the easel with a sickening thud, stumbling into the very canvas that had unmade him. "Stand down, Valerius," the captain commanded. His voice was a low, grinding stone, devoid of the practiced polish of the court. He looked at the sunstone mark on Silas's shoulder, a jagged amber-colored seal that seemed to drink in the copper glint of the firelight. "The eyes of the dead have spoken through the hands of the living. We do not serve a shadow when the sun is in the room." A wave of sound followed, the heavy, synchronized clatter of swords being lowered to the floor. It was a metallic forest, falling at once. The guards remained standing, but their heads bowed, a sea of plumed helmets dipping in the flickering light. They weren't just surrendering, they were shifting the weight of the world. Thorn emerged from the deepest shadows of the corner, moving with the silent, predatory grace of a cat. There was no sweat on his brow, no tremor in his hands. He smoothed the silk of his waistcoat, his eyes cross-referencing the new reality with terrifying speed. He didn't look at the defeated Valerius. He looked only at Silas. "A gardener's greatest skill is knowing when the season has turned," Thorn said, his voice as slick and dark as spilled ink. He bowed, a slow, deep folding of his body that was more an act of survival than respect. "The garden has been choked by weeds for 30 years, Your Highness. It seems the frost has finally arrived to clear the path." Silas didn't move. He stood with his feet braced, his torn coat hanging from his frame like a discarded shroud. The regal fury in his winter blue eyes was cold enough to crack the marble. "You kept the ledger, Thorn," Silas hissed, his voice vibrating with a decade of Outland grit. "You watched my mother, Marina, wither in the grey silt of the slums while you sipped wine in this gallery. You didn't save the seed, you hoarded it like a ransom." "I kept the truth where it wouldn't be burned," Thorn countered, his gaze shifting briefly to the ledger in Aveline's trembling hands. "A dangerous truth requires a dark room to grow in." Aveline stepped closer to Silas, the black-rimmed frames of her glasses catching a sudden flash of light. Outside, the first rays of a neon-bright winter morning were beginning to pierce the high, stained-glass windows, turning the dust motes into floating gold. "The room isn't dark anymore," Aveline said, her voice reclaiming its steady, rhythmic authority. She looked at the ruined painting, the true image ripped down the center where Valerius had fallen. The jagged tear went straight through the painted heart. "The light has found the mark." Silas looked down at his hands. They were still stained with cobalt and lead, the cuticles dark with the very pigments that had dismantled a monarchy. He felt the weight of the room, the iron-reeved history of 1,000 years, settling onto his shoulders. He could feel the Outlands calling to him, the freedom of the 3 coins and the unmapped road, but he looked at Aveline and knew that door had closed. "Captain," Silas said. The word didn't just carry sound, it carried the weight of the throne. "Take him to the black cells. He will face the High Court for the murder of my father. And Thorn," he turned his cold, storm-blue gaze on the advisor, "do not go far. I intend to dig up every root you've planted in this city. You will show me where the rot began, or you will join him in the dark." As Valerius was dragged away, his frantic protests echoing into the hollow depths of the palace, Silas turned back to the easel. He reached out and touched the torn canvas of his masterpiece. "The Outlands will have to wait," he whispered, his voice softening only for Aveline. "I have a kingdom to paint into a new light." Epilogue. 6 months had passed since the night the true image was torn. The palace no longer smelled of stagnant wax and old secrets. The windows were kept open, letting in the sharp, salt-heavy air of the Outlands. Valerius did not languish in a cell for long. The High Court, bolstered by Aveline's ledgers and the testimony of the captain of the guard, found him guilty of regicide. He was not given a public execution. Silas had seen enough blood to last a lifetime, but he was stripped of his name and exiled to the very grey silt mines where Silas's mother, Marina, had spent her final days. He was forced to work the earth he had tried to burn, a ghost in a kingdom that had forgotten him. Thorn remained, as Silas predicted, though he moved through the halls like a shadow that had been neutered. He served as the royal architect of records. Under the constant black-rimmed gaze of the new Queen's Council, he was too useful to kill and too dangerous to trust, so he was kept in a gilded cage of his own making. But the real change was found in the royal study. Silas did not ascend the throne alone. On the day of his coronation, he had ignored the centuries of royal matches Thorn had prepared for him. He didn't need a princess from a neighboring territory to legitimize his reign. He had the woman who had seen the king in the artist when he was still covered in mud. Aveline sat at a heavy, leather-bound desk across from him, though she was no longer matching servants and commoners. She was matching the kingdom's resources to its needs, her analytical mind now the invisible architecture of a fair government. She looked up as the door creaked open. Silas stood there, his crown sitting heavy on his brow, though he still preferred to keep his shirt sleeves rolled up, exposing the faint paint stains on his forearms. "The nursery is quiet," Silas whispered, his voice still carrying that low thistle thrum of authority. Aveline smiled, standing to meet him. They walked together to the cradle near the window, where the neon-bright morning sun was filtered through soft linen. Inside, 2 infants slept. Twins, a boy and a girl. The girl had her mother's obsidian hair, but when she blinked her eyes open, they were a piercing winter storm blue. The boy, however, slept with one tiny arm thrown over his head. On the small, pale curve of his left shoulder, a faint, amber-colored mark was already beginning to darken. "Another sunstone," Aveline whispered, leaning her head against Silas's shoulder. "No," Silas replied, his gaze fixed on his children. "This time, it isn't a mark of a secret. It's just a birthmark. They'll never have to hide in the Outlands, Aveline. I'm painting a world where they can stand in the light." He picked up a brush from a nearby tray, he still kept them everywhere, and looked at the blank canvas waiting in the corner. He wasn't painting ghosts anymore, he was painting a future. Thank you for listening to Love Jolt Library. If you enjoyed the story, please consider liking and subscribing.